Hello, everyone. This is YiFeng. Welcome to Watching Silent Films, where we watch silent films and talk about it. And you're on also with Bob and Lily.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Greetings, greetings. Yes, so at the time of this recording, we've been kind of publishing and pushing out all the different podcasts across various different podcasting platforms. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I do want to keep reminding listeners to ideally write a review on the Apple iTunes, or I don't think they call it that anymore. They call it the Apple podcasting platform. If you're able to leave a few stars, that's fine, but also ideally is to write a review, because that will kick up the algorithm to help other silent film lovers to find us or discover silent films, and that would be a good win for silent films, as well as any other podcast platforms you can find. We're also on YouTube. Just search for Watching Silent Films. There's a channel on there where you can also check things out. Pretty much wherever podcasts are available, there we are. And we're also across all the different social media platforms, the big ones like the Facebook, Twitters, and I guess YouTube. I can't remember now, but any number of those, you can find us. And we have an email address if you'd like to write in with questions of any silent film variety. If you're curious about, just ask, and if we find it interesting, we'll try to answer that on the podcast. The email address is watchingsilentfilms@gmail.com. Again, that's watchingsilentfilms@gmail.com. And today we're going to talk about, we've seen Dawson City, Frozen Time, and it's a documentary about silent film that was found in very, very northern, in the wilderness of Canada. Quite an interesting find there. So we'll get into that. But before that happens, just want to wish everyone a Happy New Year at the time of this recording. It's 2020 now, and I guess it doesn't really kind of matter if you're listening to podcasts afterwards, but for us, we've kind of took a bit of a break of the holidays, so we're kind of just regrouping now. And so, Happy Holidays, everyone. Happy New Year's. And just want to catch up on kind of what we've been watching in the classic realm. And usually what I mean is just... sometime before the 60s and 70s, I guess. That's what I would venture to say is the classic realm. Bob or Lily, you guys caught up on anything older that you guys watch recently?
Nope.
Not from the 60s, 70s that I can recall.
That's okay. Just curious.
Yeah, all I really saw was the newest Little Women, and I guess since it's set in the 1800s, I'm not sure if that counts.
Yeah.
I mean, I watched Catch Me If You Can, which is a movie I really love and recommend, but
Yeah.
it is from later than 2000. So.
Oh, yes. Yes. That's okay. I was just curious. I tend to, as you may or may not know, gravitate towards the older realm. Not that I'm biased against the newer one. Maybe I am. I don't know. Maybe I am. I don't know. But I saw this. I have these like really long backlog lists. You know how like when some people recommend like you have to watch this in the past.
Mm-hmm.
I used to put them on a long list, and the list of course grows longer and longer, and then you never get around to it. Well, I've decided that. I'm not super old, but I feel like at a certain point in time, sometimes I kind of muse upon my mortality and think about like I might be inching towards the fact that there might be less time ahead of me than behind me. Like there's less time I have to live on Earth. So I'm like, at some point, I just gotta do away with these lists and forget it, because there's no point in keeping it, and just kind of let the chips fall where they may and all that stuff. So, as a sort of a celebration of that, I guess I kind of just am becoming more random. it's one of those things it prevents me from watching older movies. You know what I mean? All the way through.
Mm.
Because it's like I get so caught up in picking what to watch that I just end up like ultimately not watching anything at all. Does that make sense?
Really?
Yeah.
It happens all the time for me.
Indecision, huh?
Well, it's not so much the indecision, but if you have a list that's like either, hundreds or maybe thousands,
Yeah.
or I don't know, I don't remember what the list was, but I didn't really number it, but it was ridiculous, and it's just like, at some point in time, you just have to think like, what's
Put them on
point?
a dartboard and throw the dart.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that idea.
And so then you're like, what's the point of keeping it if you're just going to be random, So that's kind of where I landed. I was like, you know what? Forget this list. And I had this movie called Late Spring, and there's some relationship with silent film. He's a Japanese director. Well, I typically have seen a big chunk of Akira Kurosawa, who's one of my favorite directors, if not
He's
my favorite.
fantastic.
Now, I'm about halfway or more through his entire filmography. I intend to try to finish it at some point in time. But the other popular, very famous Japanese director of that similar era is Ozu. Yasujiro, I can't pronounce it, but the Ozu, it's just like one of the like, if you know Japanese films, it's kind of the deeper cuts, right, of the director and his most famous one, probably the most famous one, is Tokyo Story in the 50s. I didn't watch that one, but I watched the one before that. It's kind of like a trilogy, as it were, and the first one of which was called Late Spring, and it was incredible. Like, when you watch these movies, and there's some connection to silent film because he started his career as a silent film director, and unfortunately, a big chunk of it is lost. I don't even know if you could get your hands on any. I didn't look, but if there are, we ought to review some of them. But Japanese silent films tend to go later into the 30s, rather than most of the silent films worldwide ended by the late 20s, 28, 29. But the Japanese kept going because in the silent film era, they had this, I'm forgetting the term now. I read this huge amount of articles about it, but there's this explainer of silent films. As you watch the movie, there's a person using a mic, like narrating and explaining the movie to you. And the reason why is because if you're Japanese and you're watching, like, A Trip to the Moon, you might not know all the context.
Right.
And so you've got to have this person who explains some of what's happening in the movie to you, the audience, to give you context. And that used to be a profession. There used to be tens of thousands of people. That was their job. And so, and sometimes they were bigger than the actual film and even the stars themselves of movies, because people like the way that it's part of the cinematic watching experience. And in fact, they talked about how other silent film narrators, there were some in the U.S. as well. There's actually quite a number of people internationally, worldwide, everywhere, not just Japan. But Japan seemed to really like that. And that's why their silent films went into the 30s, 37, 38s. So, anyways, what was I getting at? Oh, so Late Spring is not a silent film, but it was just a few years after the silent film era was lost. And it's about, essentially, a daughter of a father who was kind of living at home still, but the dad really wants her to get married, and it's about tradition. It's about like Japanese culture going from more ancient sort of, more sort of social norms to what the modern things are. Like, they used to sit on mats, and then in the film it talks about how the younger people like to sit on chairs. Visually, extremely amazing, just the depiction of that. But it was such an emotional movie. That was the thing that I didn't really expect. Not that I'm saying that Japanese movies aren't emotional. Anyways, I just didn't. I had no context of what it was, and you think about like films where it's all about character and story. I mean, this thing was like seeped, enriched in just, it was all character, all story, all emotion. You know, like what films are supposed to be doing. You know what I mean? Anyways, highly recommended.
Mm-hmm. I will look it up.
Yeah, Ozu is just one of the greatest film directors of all time. It's like it's usually brought up very closely after Kurosawa. Kurosawa is the big one that's like, you know, the giant, right? Like everybody knows. But Ozu also is up there, and I'm very just. I was so like, I just, yeah. So
now you said Late Spring is part of a series.
Well, sort of. It's
okay.
It's not like, you know, the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
No,
not like this. But yeah, it's like it's the way that the director worked with the actress who played the daughter. Yeah, I think it was the first movie of the 3 that they've done in collaboration. And Tokyo Story, I think it was either the second or third. But if you look it up in the Wikipedia, it tells you all this stuff. That's how I found out. Is I just read it on Wikipedia. So, but yeah. So yeah, that's Yasujiro Ozu. Late Spring was 1949. So Tokyo Story 1953 and Autumn Afternoon 1962. So that's just incredible. The movies he's done, it's just so rich in everything. So, anyways, later on, if we ever get a chance to, if it's even possible, his silent films are available. We should try to check that out if it's possible. But anyways, enough about what we're have been watching. Let's get into the feature documentary, I guess, this time. Dawson City, Frozen Time. This came out in 2016. It took 3 years of collecting the footage and 1 year of editing it. So it's about roughly 2 hours long on the dot. It came out in 2016. And it's directed by Bill Morrison. And it's essentially about Dawson City in Canada, which is on the intersection of the Yukon River and Klondike River, essentially. If you don't know where that is in the context, it's, if you look at the map of Alaska, it's like, you know, eastern center, I guess, mid part of the eastern border of Alaska. You cross the border, and that's where Dawson City is. So it's pretty far up north in Canada, and this film essentially tells you the story of not just the lost films that it was discovered, but it tells you the story of the city itself, the Dawson City, and finally bringing up to modern times, where it tells you that buried under one of the recreation centers or you know, all-purpose buildings was buried 533 silent film reels that they restored back to I think something like 300. I wrote this down here.
It's like 373 about
exactly, that. Yeah, 372 silent film titles. It's the only copy left because all the other copies have rotted away or have been lost in time.
Disappeared, yeah.
Yeah, so that's
Gone.
essentially what the documentary is about. But the way it was done was quite interesting as well. Do you guys want to take a stab at how do you think it was? How would you describe it to somebody who's never seen this?
Possibly, you would have to want to be you would want to be interested in learning history about a specific place. For me, it was a little. The movie itself was a little dry. Learning about how Dawson City came to be was extremely interesting, and what brought people there was the gold rush. But at the same time, I felt as if it delved into areas around the Yukon that didn't seem to really matter to the story. In ways it did, but it didn't. To me, it didn't seem very blended, or at least not as much as it could have been. if that makes sense. So, that was kind of my opinion. Like, the whole Dawson City was very fascinating, and how it got, how its population increased to 40,000 people, and then within a year it dropped when they found gold in Nome, Alaska, so everyone left. So, I don't know. That's all. That's what I can say. It's like a niche sort of history lesson.
It is. What I found remarkable about it was, and I thought it was brilliant, that they took the footage they got, and it was artistic in many ways, because it was a history lesson, and what they did was they incorporated the scenes from the various footage they got that was recovered, and they would show various scenes from the movies to illustrate points they were making. And what I love most is that they took a documentary about a find of silent films, and they made it a silent film. They made a documentary as a silent film about silent films. And
there it is.
Very clever.
Yes, it's very clever. That's really the key. Is that?
But I love how they take like one section and they talk about they talk about something happening where they go through a door, and they're showing all these different scenes in doorways and outdoors, in this sequence. And I think that's so humorous. They've got this great quiet humor in there. And I think it's also, let's see, the history that is learned through the footage that was restored is amazing. I mean, what you see, it's like learning a history lesson, but visually, like almost like you're seeing the history on film right in front of you.
Yeah, you're seeing it. You're experiencing it. You're not even reading about it, right?
And I think that's amazing. Like I feel like I could almost taste and smell what it was like to be in the middle of the gold rush. I mean, you see these guys, mostly guys, some women, and the women playing cards and drinking with them. You know what I mean? Like, not the typical turn of the century women's etiquette.
Yeah, it's a little bit like, oh man, I'm forgetting things today. What was that show? It'll come to me. Just keep going.
Television program?
Who's the actor?
Briscoe County Jr. So in the early 90s, for those who are too young to remember, there was a TV show with Bruce Campbell, who is typically the campy guy from Evil Dead and stuff. But he starred in this TV series called Adventures of Briscoe County Jr. And in that, it really has some of these elements that we're talking about. Sometimes like Gold Rush, sometimes women prospectors and doing all those things. It just reminded me of some of the episodes from there. But anyway, keep going.
Well, I thought it was interesting when I was watching it. I thought that originally I got the impression that what they were showing was a mix of photographs, because they start talking about the photographer, Hess. Is that right?
It's a Hegg, Hegg.
Hegg,
yeah,
right, Hegg, which is an interesting name. But they start talking about the photographer, and then then they move to the films. But they use a blend of photographs, stills, and films. And initially, I thought they were focusing mostly on the films, but then they threw in other ones. They blended in other ones like Charlie Chaplin from the Gold Rush, which of course applies, but it's not the film that was recovered. I thought they were mainly dealing with the pieces that were restored from that site, but that isn't quite right. They used other sources as well. So, Which isn't good or bad. It's not a critique. It's just a comment. It's just an observation.
So now it's probably a good time to look at to kind of get some context into why the style was done that way in this documentary. So Bill Morrison is actually kind of an avant-garde documentary filmmaker. He started in the 90s, and his greatest work that before this one was called Decasia, like decay mixed in with the word Fantasia, because critics of his work would say that, well, your stuff is kind of like Fantasia, right? You know, like the Disney Fantasia, with Mickey Mouse directing classical music and stuff.
Oh,
right?
yeah, I know that one.
So it's like, and the reason that was, they criticized him that way, and he was like, oh man, I do not want to be associated with that. What about Decasia? Like, he was more about decay rather than Fantasia. Now, so his artwork, he's heavily inspired by avant-garde artists of the past in the, half a century ago. Have you heard of Bracage? B-R-A-H. I'm not spelling this right, but G-H-A-G-E or something. He's kind of like this avant-garde filmmaker.
Broke?
Well, essentially, those filmmakers would take aged film, nitrate film, just like Bill's doing here, and kind of painting a collage of that as their own artistic avant-garde movies. So he's heavily inspired by two of those greater. I forgot the guy's name, but so there's a. If you search for Bill Morrison on YouTube, there's a Filmstruck half-an-hour special about him. I'll try to link that in the film notes. And it talks about how he was inspired by those people, but also, like, one day he was watching somebody else doing avant-garde work, and it was about Adam and Eve, and it was like an old Nitrate film about Adam and Eve, and all of a sudden, when the fruit or apple, whatever it is that Eve was giving Adam, when that happened, the entire film just like exploded. So it was essentially symbolic of the fall of mankind, right? Like how the physical state of film was in such a decay because it was recorded like almost 100 years ago now, that like the film medium represents the fall of man. Like that's kind of the thing he wants to try to accomplish. Does that make sense? So since that time when he was inspired by that thing, he was like, oh, I found my niche, essentially. So ever since then, a lot of his works, shorts and films and stuff, have been revolved around getting nitrate film and kind of doing his stuff, right? And this Dawson City happens to be that specific thing for a city that he targeted. But before this, he did something about Decasia, where he took this. It was the same exact style. He took a bunch of early film that is decayed, so much so that like the Library of Congress has a shelf with his name on it, where if they find nitrate that's almost gone, that's like rotting, like, oh, this is for this guy. So so he takes that and incorporates it into his work, his artwork. So that's kind of his thing. His modus operandi is that he takes this old nitrate film footage, like many artists before him, and he tries to do something about life, birth, maturity, death, and this whole cycle. A lot of his motif of his documentary avant-garde films is all about that, and also just like what it means as you're viewing something that the nitrate film recorded. It's in a very state of decay,
Right.
And so it's all like very, very symbolic and very avant-garde. I mean, this is definitely, anybody can interpret it different ways, So this particular work is actually the most story-driven because if you look at the other stuff, it's hard to make sense of it, which is why it's kind of a struggle. I'm not a big avant-garde fan myself, but one could see where if it wasn't for this film's focus on Dawson City in Canada and talking about the histories of that and how the film itself, and it also happens to talk about film itself too, which I don't know if he did that in the past, but it's such a fascinating thing that for his context, like of the works that he has done previously, that's kind of his style essentially, right? Of how he's doing things. And so in this documentary film, yes, he's talking about the city, and yes, he's talking about these silent films that has been found and finally restored and kind of the story behind that, but also he's doing something more than that. He's trying to kind of tell you a story about how these people, especially like in the beginning section, there was a chief, right? It's
right.
Toshesh. Let me see. I wrote this down. Trochek. So it's like a Trochek sort of native people of
the tribe, right?
The tribe, the First Nation Indian of that land. Well, when all these prospectors came in, they just all of a sudden staked claim. Like I was like, where are you staking the claim from? Like there's a person named Ladu. He just claimed 160 acres as his property and started selling it. It's like just out of nowhere. It's like kind of the frontier space, It's like
yep.
You just go in there, and then eventually, years later, he relocated the police from the Dawson City, relocated the Trochek people 5 kilometers down to Moosehead. That's like what gives them the right to be like, this is ours now because there's gold.
Yeah, exactly.
And you go over there. Like it makes no sense, right?
Power.
Yeah, just displacing everything. Anyways, why I was saying that is because that's kind of some of the things that Bill Morrison's trying to do is like there's a picture of him and some footage film of him in the beginning and also like decades later as he's older and kind of towards the end of his life. But also just the passage of time and how the different films are decaying, and same thing with his history too is decaying. It's an added layer of symbolism that he likes to play with in his visual representation of this work. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
So now you have more context. That I didn't know that context as I was watching it, so I probably had the same reaction as Lily as well. But now that I think back on it with more context, it's like, well, I guess it makes sense what he's trying to do, right?
I like the way he put things together. I mean, even the way he put together, like the fact that he starts the documentary off with the guy in, I think it was the 50s, doing with his backhoe, was doing excavation in the site and found the film buried. And then he talks about the gold rush. So he's talking about the city of Dawson being part of the gold rush because it has buried treasure, it has gold. And then he moves into the films and what happens to the films, and they are like buried treasure.
Yeah, exactly. Because the gold is the film, right? So it's all the symbols.
The film is a later form of gold. Which
is interesting because the film itself has silver, right? So there's something to that. But before that happens, did you notice that in the beginning there was the World Series or the 1970 Red versus White Sox? That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right? Like just the ability to see that, like visually. I mean,
right. And I assume that was lost footage that was found in Dawson.
Oh yeah, and so if you watch this film, every time you see the Dawson City Film Fund, that is the footage that they found from Dawson City. Whereas
so we learned so much, from
and so
this.
if it doesn't have that label, then it's like another film from either MoMA, which is the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, or from Library of Congress or something like that. Some other nitrate film footage that he spliced in to pad out the story, and or photographs to tell the story that he wants to tell. So let's keep going with that. Is that in the beginning I was like, that was huge to me. I mean, I'm not a huge baseball fan, but it was still good to see the fact that, you know, there's something prior to television that you could have like a White Sox versus Red Sox game, you know, recorded in some sort of film medium.
You're right.
And did you guys like that section of how they explain nitrate, like what it was and the whole process?
Yeah, I really enjoyed that.
Because in our first podcast, Liliana, we talked about how the whole film emulsion and all that stuff, the technical stuff, but here they show it to you, which is cool, how they made it.
Yeah, I was very surprised to see how fast it burned. I mean, you know, same exact you was just saying. We talked about it, but once you see it visually, you're like, oh my god.
Well, it's why that and it's surprising and shocking that they didn't have a safety film until the 1949, which is basically for the first, you know, half of the existence of film in history of all films, it's flammable.
Right, very.
Right, which is why, you know, huge amounts of them are lost due to fires, like all the time.
And they illustrated that by how many theaters burnt down in that town. In fact, the whole section of town burnt down.
Yeah, that's later on. But essentially, the fires just... every year there was a fire in the first decade of the town's existence.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Which is
all the worse for storing highly flammable film.
Well, it wasn't just the film, though. It wasn't just the film.
Yeah, what I mean is, if the conditions are already there, prone to fire.
Yeah.
And then they show the clip of the guy working with the film with a cigarette in his mouth.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my God, yeah, and he burned, what did it say, 30 feet of it?
30,000.
30,000, yes.
That was the movie called Trail of Tears of 98, which is 1898, which is, you know, the book and novel, or I guess it was a book and also became a movie, adapted into a movie itself as a silent film, and both of which detail like that whole story about like the whole gold rush in that area, you know.
Well, it was also really funny how the woman said very humorously how the kids would see the film sticking out of the ground. They go over and light it just to see it go up like fireworks.
Yeah.
Yeah, every time they light it, I'm like, what are you doing? This is important. Don't light it up. Like, it could be some, you know, critical film that's lost, and they're just like lighting up to test it. I'm like, oh,
yep.
It's crazy, man. But yeah, I mean, it's that whole thing is incredible to actually see it, the process, and to know that film is a chemical process. We often forget that in these days of digital sort of cinema and how it's recorded and projected and played back. But even in analog days of when we had, you know, actual film cameras, it still wasn't flammable. It was already pretty safe by the time that it got to us.
Yeah, I mean, kids today have to be explained what film is because they're never going to see it.
Exactly. But it's you know, the thing I want to stress is that it's a chemical process, you know, and it's so much has to do with, and if you watch this documentary, you actually see the physical decay of the film negative, and people always ask the director, Bill Mercer, what kind of Photoshop filters are you using? And it's like, no, this is all real.
Right.
There is no special effects. It's like it's
right.
as is. They scan the film print, and that's what you see is what you get, you know?
Yeah.
And what I loved, I think, was right after it demoed the film process, you know, safety versus nitrate and stuff, we saw the Lumiere brothers. I mean...
Yeah, that was pretty incredible.
Because Lily and I talked about in the first episode about how in 1895 it was kind of the demo, you know, felt around the world of cinema and film, moving pictures, you know, is that when they did that in Paris, it changed like the landscape of film, you know what I mean? Moving pictures. Mm. And to see them on film was incredible, you know? itself, like on film itself. Like it was brought to life, like you were saying earlier, Bob, that when you're seeing it, it's different than just reading about it or seeing still photography. But that fire in Paris in 1897, like, killed 126 people. It's insane.
Wow.
But I love how there's so many sort of, as the history of the city itself was established, it, like you were saying earlier, Bob, of how the gold rush is representative, is somehow linked to the treasure that is silent film. So too, I think, is the symbolism of like this town / city was being built, mirroring sort of the rise of film itself, right? As the city was being built up towards talkies, and so is the same with just the various different films that started to get made. And also it calls to different types of people in history that interacts with the town. Because I wrote the end, I'm like, what kind of a town would be so influential? You think this, if you look at the map, it's literally middle of nowhere, right?
It is.
Yeah, it's like, how is this town that was in the middle of nowhere that became so influential, right, across so many different spectrums of, whether it's the people building theaters. There was a I didn't write it down, Patagas or something. There was a guy who was building theaters, hundreds of theaters across America.
Pantagus, I think.
Yeah,
it's
and
Pantagus, I think his name.
He got his start there too, and it's like it was him. It was like Jack London, the author of Call of the Wild and other works, and of course they had to put a dig with Trump, who created the brothel. I wrote that down. So Trump's fortune, Fred Trump, started as a brothel. That's where the start of the family fortune started.
That's right. But Jack London didn't actually make it. He got syphilis, I think, and had to go home again. He didn't make the journey. So.
But what I'm saying is, it inspired him to write all those works, and this film references so many people that have just were influenced by the city. That, like, it talked about how one of the photographer people presented the films like the way that Ken Burns is doing, decades before Ken Burns was doing.
Wasn't that Haig? That was Haig, right?
Yeah, I forgot. I didn't write it down. I don't remember. But it was either him or his company. He has he ended up opening a company there. So, but yeah, I mean,
he was the first one to pan a still image, and it became a thing.
Right, exactly. So it was like it was so influential for a town that was like in the middle of nowhere.
Yep.
But yeah, like you were saying, after the gold rush started to kind of go full bloom, and they started to have this huge corporations come in, and the destruction on the land was like shocking, right? They had the footage of like
at the end,
of what happened to the land and
the after effect, the decay.
That was crazy. But I think what I was so interested in towards the beginning when the city was established was all the when the gold rush is happening, and after a while the prospectors who got rich stayed behind, but then it's like up to the people to exploit those people who have the fortunes, if that makes sense.
They were prospecting the prospectors.
Exactly. And so they opened saloons, casinos, dance halls, theaters. And that's where I just found it interesting that I feel like this, even though it's one specific city, it was a microcosm that's representative of the macrocosm of the time and the place in history, right?
Yep.
Like if these types of entertainment places were being built for this town, think about what was being built elsewhere, right? If you kind of zoom out of there and go to some any town in America, right?
Right.
With a certain number of people, across a couple of thousand people threshold, you're bound to have saloons, casinos, dance halls, and theaters, and movie palaces. And
my impression of Dawson City from the film was that it is the low bar of, I mean, at least initially, it was the low bar of standards that, it was nitty gritty prospectors. But eventually the town became a town. And then later on they said, they got rid of all the brothels and dance halls.
mm-hmm.
And they wanted to make the town respectable. And they did. It became like a family town. And then they opened the athletic association opened up that pavilion that they love so much.
Yeah, and then also the libraries and various different building structures.
Yeah, I thought that was another progression underlying progression within the story that was really great. I mean, they were talking. I mean, you already mentioned it as well, as the progression of the town through the years.
But that's what I loved about it, because it really showed us a slice of life that gives us visually a context of how these silent films are shown. Like all these different movies that we've been kind of viewing now and talking about, and like when we talked about like Nosferatu, for example, or maybe different movies that we had talked about how the people used to experience and watch it. They experienced it, watched it in towns and places like this,
right?
Or similar to this, where
this is the dead end. This is the end.
Well, regardless of this specific city, I was thinking more of the historic context. Like, right. Even if you lived in any other town, like that was of similar sizes, you'd still get something with different halls and different locations and different building structures that's capable of, audiences who would come in and watch these movies.
Right.
And that's what I'm talking about, is like these. We had mentioned it many times before in the previous podcast, where the context of the time of the people watching the films is just, it was kind of distraction outside of their. Remember, these times were historically, it was a move away from agrarian society and culture of farming and sort of those very labor-intensive work towards more factory into the city more, and
right.
People
the
industrialization, and people started to have more free time and potentially some disposable income, and as that progression changed, so too did the people's ability to enjoy different types of entertainment, right?
Right. You talk about the silent films being shown in this way, out of the way place. It was really interesting when they showed the news articles about the Yukon and about the fires and stuff. And it almost felt to me like people in New York and Chicago would have been reading these news articles about this place which held this sense of awe, in a way, because it's the place of the gold rush,
Right.
And everyone wanted to go there. And even people who couldn't go there dreamed about going.
Exactly.
Striking out and getting gold. And
it's kind of like a romantic notion of an adventure, right?
Right.
But
that's part of the beauty of the progression, is that it went from being this mystical place about gold to being one of the first well, I shouldn't say first places, but to being this place which film still managed to be there and became a big part of their society. Like the silent films, like you were saying, being shown at the theaters, they had like 3 different places in town showing films.
Right.
And I think that's pretty amazing. The films meant so much to them. They would get them like 2 to 5 years after they showed in the real world.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was pretty insane. It said one film came out in 1915, and then I think it said 1920 it came to Dawson and premiered. I was like, wow.
Exactly.
But it probably wasn't totally uncommon for places like that in very, very remote regions where you need to, where you want to try to get film. Like it was the end of the line, where the films that get sent.
Right. But what was so cool about it was that it started off talking about the films because of the gold rush. It was one of the first places being filmed. Am I wrong?
Right, yes.
So I think that's remarkable that one of the first places using film because of the gold rush, because of the sensation of it, ended up being literally one of the last places the films ended up.
I love how, like, when they were disposing of it, they took it out of the basement of the library and threw it into the river.
Oh, that kills me. That killed me.
That was crazy.
Yeah, and the guy's excuse like, "Oh, we're just keeping up with the times." Okay. I was wondering though, after all these years, I don't know, like, because of the way Nitrate is designed, I wonder if you could find any of those, if they'd still be salvageable. Possibly not though, with salt.
What, in the river?
Or if someone found one in the ocean.
Who knows where that river went to?
They'd have to be. They'd have to be water sealed.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Because even the ones that were dug up, you could see the water damage on them. Some of them were really bad.
Yeah.
And those weren't in a river.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a feeling you wouldn't recover much from what's at the bottom of a river.
I was curious though, because you're like, oh, let's just dump all of our trash, and by the way, let's dump all the silent films. Why not? Because
I wanted the same thing, Lily. I honestly wanted the same thing.
Just
it's a
so
tragedy.
pain.
It really
It
is.
is a tragedy.
Painful tragedy.
Yeah. It's just crazy that they threw trash right in the river, though. It just shows. I feel like it shows some of the destruction of man going into nature. It's just like, where are we gonna dump the trash? Just put it in the river. I just flying by. It's like,
right.
What?
It shows that our destruction of our environment started 100 years ago.
Oh, even longer than that, I'm sure.
Exactly.
But, yeah, just to update, by the way, from earlier, the film wasn't Trail of Tears, but rather Nanook of the North, where the guy...
Nanook of the North!
Yeah, he burned 30,000 feet with a cigarette. That was Robert Flaherty.
Famous character there.
Feet.
Have you seen that one, Bob?
I've heard of the character, that's all.
Yeah, we should watch that.
The film.
That's a silent film, for
There's
sure.
been songs written about that character, that guy.
Yeah, I've seen it. It's really great. It's it really was the first sort of documentary where you could tell it's shaped, like, on purpose to tell a story. But then all documentary kind of is, anyways. So, anyways, the other note I had was, like, I think we mentioned this in passing before, but when we saw some of those Fox Movie Tone News or any of those news type organizations, it really was like TV. Like before TV, TV didn't come out until the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and yet here we are, decades before that. It really felt like you were watching like a TV broadcast of sort of life happening on the frontiers, of this place.
Yeah. It's publicity and showmanship and advertising and all that.
Yeah.
Been around a lot longer than newsprint.
Yeah.
We've always known how to do that. Storytelling.
I looked at the clock when I was watching the film. So for the first hour, it really didn't really talk about the movie. It just talked about the town, and it was the second hour that they talked about the films, more related, tying into the film stuff. So that was interesting. It was like half about the town's setup, and then the other half then brought it home about how they found and restored the film.
Exactly. I was actually stunned in the first 9 minutes before the credits first came on, that I was like, I actually was asking, what am I watching? Because we talk about silent films, and I thought I was watching a commercial that was coming on before the film, and then I realized, no, it's an intro to the film.
Oh yeah, I just did it right away. There's no talking heads. There's not a lot of talking heads.
There's not very much talk in it at all.
Yeah.
But
What I I did like about this film, though, is I feel I really learned a lot from the way they designed it. Because they made it into its own type of silent film, you became more engaged in the photographs and all the language that they put on the screen before you. So I don't know. Exactly. I feel like I have a good grasp of what this movie was and what it's about. Besides, just the obvious, like, oh, this is where film got left for 50 years, basically.
I agree.
Well, that's the nature of silent film, to demand your attention. Because there's no dialogue, so you do have to visually pay more attention to it.
I wonder how a group of 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, if you showed this in class in a school and you put it on in front, I wonder how engrossed they'd be.
Oh, I think they'll fall asleep. That's what I think.
You might be right. It'd be like schoolwork to them, yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not really action packed. It's very, you have to.
It's not action packed. No,
it's not at all. Because
they look up from their phones when they hear about fire.
Yeah.
Fire.
Well, I think all of us here have already experiences with silent films, so I think we're kind of the right audience, as it were, for this film. But if you were not watching silent films and you only watch movies made after Star Wars, and you were trying to watch this movie, I don't know. I don't think you can last long. I think you'll watch it and be like, I don't know what I'm watching, and there's no story.
Yeah.
And they're gonna tune out, right? So
yeah.
I think you have to be.
You're right.
I think you have to be a particular type of audience. Now, I don't think that's what Bill Morrison is intending this movie to be like, but
he has a targeted audience.
No, I don't know. I think he wants everybody to try to experience this. I think that's his goal. But in actuality, when it plays out in real life, I'm not sure.
No.
That modern audiences.
You gotta either
2 hours.
Yeah,
you gotta either silent films or you have to like documentaries.
Yeah, and history and stuff. And even if you like documentaries, modern documentaries. I don't know if you've seen some of the modern documentaries. We're kind of in the golden age of documentaries, by the way. Like currently, I don't know if you guys know that.
We're in a what?
We're kind of in a golden age of documentaries.
Oh yes.
And
some of the recent documentaries have been fantastic.
But the way they're cut is so dramatic, right? And in this documentary is unlike any of those other ones. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's there's no action, there's no pacing, at least not by modern standards. But of course, we have experience of silent films, so we know what it is. You know what I mean? We know what we're watching. We can give it context.
Well, I found that several times in the film, when they did a segue, I felt like, well, that's an abrupt change to going, now we're talking about this. And then after you watch for 5 to 10 minutes, you realize, oh, so that's how it ties in, you know?
Yeah.
I thought, that's very clever.
It is, but a lot of the modern audiences need to be fed, you know?
Yeah, they don't want to wait to figure things out. I have a friend who doesn't like mysteries at all. I recently saw Knives Out, and my friend didn't want to go and see it because he says, I don't like mysteries. And of course,
yep.
and it struck my brain you don't like having to figure something out, you know? And
yeah.
I guess that also ties in with what you were saying about, kids will be lost right away.
Yeah, it's our instant gratification society now.
Yeah.
And I really think that's almost a downfall for us. I mean, my friend was telling me about that movie because that's we were mentioning Chris Evans earlier before we got started with the podcast because he's in it. And I would like to go see it. I mean, but I'm a different person than, a kid 15 years younger than me who can't get off their phone. So they're going to want to know who done it right away, where I'd be like, oh, okay, let me try to figure this out.
Mm.
Well, that's part of the fun if you're watching this.
I loved it, by the way. I loved it.
Yeah. Anywho,
Getting back to Dawson.
yeah. Do you guys have any other parting thoughts? I think we pretty much exhausted it.
I did write down a question for just us to answer. Probably, what was the most compelling thing that you learned from watching this film? Unless we've already said that.
I think it's the recognition that things that might be historical should not be tossed aside casually.
Mm-hmm. I 100% agree. Not dumped into a pool, not dumped into the river, not burned, not put in a box. Actually, a box is okay, but
Yeah.
I don't know what is the most compelling, I would say, but I think what I learned about this movie is that, you know, what you think is lost might not be lost forever. I think that's what I learned. It's like, think about all those 372 film titles before this, the 60s and 70s. Everybody was like, this is lost. Mm. And then they found this and they restored it. It's like, oh, it's found again. You know, it's
exactly.
Like, so you think that, you know, potentially some of these long lost, there are many titles where the footage is lost or the cuts are lost, and then you come to find out it's buried under somewhere. I mean,
you know, it reminds me of a scene in Indiana and Raiders of the Lost Ark when Indiana Jones is talking to Belloc, and he says, you know, you take this, I forgot what it was, like salt shaker, and he says it's worth like 50 cents. But you bury it in the sand for 1,000 years and it becomes priceless.
Yeah. You're right. Yeah, I mean, but, you know, having said that, there are, it really depends on what the film is. I think if the film hasn't been widely distributed, the likelihood and chance of finding all the lost footage is very slim. It's basically next to nil. For example, man, my brain's not working today. What's the Orson Welles movie, Citizen Kane? After Citizen Kane, he made another movie.
Rebecca?
No, that was Alfred Hitchcock.
Sorry.
What was the movie that he made? I have it here. Magnificent Amberson. Sorry, it's right here.
Oh, okay.
I have the DVD of it. But so that's his follow-up. Orson Welles, one of the greatest directors who ever lived. Now, he made that movie, and it was a certain length cut. It's like something like 2 hours or something like that. And he made his director's cut. Now, he was onto this next project in Brazil. So he flew to Brazil, and while he was there, the studios was basically like, they don't like this Orson Welles character. And he was like, we're going to recut the movie because it's too long. He spent too much money, and the studio heads were so vindictive against Orson Welles that they took the original film negative and destroyed it. Like his Orson Welles cut is basically gone forever because the studio heads were so vindictive that they basically destroyed it. And so the only print that's left technically is what's available now, which is like a hour and 40-minute cut. So they lost or something like that. I don't know. There's some details like that. I'm probably not doing it justice, but it was something along the lines where the Orson Welles cut is basically gone, and the studios created a new cut without the director's input. And then it's one of those things the film nerds, film historians are always like, "Oh, I wish you could see the Orson Welles cut." Well, it was never like, they never made like thousands of prints of it. Does that make sense? It never debuted. So potentially there may have been some cuts where it was sent from the studio, the editors. There's some rumors, right, where it was sent to Orson Welles while he was in Brazil. Maybe he has a cut. Maybe he's hidden it somewhere. Maybe it's lost somewhere. Like, that's all rumors and hearsay. But the probability of it being found, just like this Dawson City thing is probably next to nil because of the fact that it wasn't that there weren't many copies of that. There was only a handful, literally, like one or two or maybe less. And the rest is destroyed. So the opportunities of a film like that to be uncovered is probably next to nil. Now, a film like Greed, which is a silent film. Have you guys heard of this? 1920 Greed. You guys never heard of it? Greed.
Maybe.
It's one of the. It's
Who's in it? Could look it up too.
Yeah, it's Oh, sorry, my Eric von Stroheim. That's his name. So he made this film called Greed, 1924, and there was a 4 or 5 hour cut, and of course it got away from him. It's long gone now. So now it's instead of 4 hours, 3 or 4 hours, it's like 2 or less or something like that. Oh, actually, originally 8 hours. It's super long.
8 hours.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. So this is one of those quote unquote holy grails for film archivists who, like, if they find this, it's like, wow, like, they'll proclaim it as one of the greatest films ever made or something like that.
Wow.
So anyway, why I'm bringing all this up is because there's so many quote unquote lost films, and then with time there'll be footages and or films found. A perfect example of that recently, at least my recent, is Metropolis. So Metropolis, for a long time, had only been about roughly hour and half cut, roughly, maybe hour and 40 minutes. Don't quote me on that. But in Brazil, somebody unearthed missing footage from the original Metropolis film. They found it, and they're like, wow, this is amazing. And they recut that footage back, and now it's like 2 hours.
Wow.
So that's an illustration of, like, getting back on topic of what was supposedly lost is now basically almost complete. It's still not 100%, but it's pretty close. So it's unfortunate. A big chunk of silent films are basically not finished. You know what I mean? As you're watching it, you're like, oh, yeah, you think it's finished. It's only the ones in the 20s that are potentially closer to being finished than not.
It's interesting at the beginning, sorry to sideline, but at the beginning of this film, they said like 75% of all silent films have been lost to time for one reason or another. It's funny because I was mentioning that to my brother, and he talked about how many different types of films there may be, and you're talking about completed films, but, small time people directing in small local areas, like were never major theater releases, but I mean, they're talking about theater releases, I assume.
Right.
When they say 75% have been lost, I assume they're meaning theater releases.
Yeah, I think of what they can get their hands on. There have been silent films where it wasn't shown very long. Some of them, because of the way silent films were treated, you basically only had a handful of days to be popular, and if you didn't, they just pull it. So there have been films that we think now, it's like, oh, it's amazing, but then, like, in certain places it was only shown for a couple of days and they pulled it. And whereas in certain cities it would go on for, weeks.
Right.
And every city and town has their own different preferences. It's not as homogenized, I guess, as it is right now, the theaters and distribution, because it was more localized, if that makes sense. Wherever film goes out, it plays so differently in every town and city, and different contexts and cultures, and different people experience it in different ways.
Yep.
Whereas now you go to a multiplex and it's like it's the same pretty much everywhere. It's homogenized.
Well, I'm talking from the mid '90s. They still had a lot of tailoring. I worked as a movie theater manager, and they did tailor quite a bit the films that went to each theater based upon their clientele.
Right. But like,
it's an interesting thing.
But like, you wouldn't have.
They still do.
But you wouldn't, you you wouldn't cut the movie a different way, or you wouldn't generally you would give it some time to gain some audiences and allow audiences to find it. But films back then were so aggressive that sometimes it would only play, like if it plays on it's not the same sort of trajectory we have today where you debut something on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then if it makes it over the weekend, you're good for another week. Back then, it was something like, oh, we'll debut this movie on Monday, and then by Wednesday or Thursday, if it's not popular, we'll pull it out of there. It's just so different,
Much more free-flowing than regimented.
Yeah, and if you recall, like even in Dawson City, it's these prospector-type people who may have constituted some of the audiences, and they don't care about weekends. They can work anytime. It wasn't there was no Monday through Friday work schedule. It was like, I might prospect on Sunday, and on Monday I'm gonna take a break and watch a movie, and you just don't. There is no. The entire context is different,
Yeah.
So, thus it was with the films when it was exhibited too, back in that era of time.
Yeah.
All right, folks. Any parting thoughts?
I thought it was well worth watching.
Yeah, reason I really want to get in there just to find out what the story was of how they. I mean, I knew of that story high level, but I didn't know the details. And of course, this movie gave us all the details of how these silent film were retrieved and found and ultimately restored.
It makes me want to see more by that director,
Bill Morrison.
Bill Morrison, yeah.
Yeah, I think Decasia is this big one. So if you can get your hands on that, I didn't look to see where it's available. It's probably at the library, if anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's a big one for him.
I will do that.
Lily, any parting thoughts?
Don't throw away silent film reels. Gosh, guys. If you find one, don't burn it.
Well, to be fair,
Nope.
playing devil's advocate, like the studio, they did call the studio, and they did ask if you want it back, and the studio was like, just destroy it. So they were literally following, the marching orders of the rights owners, right?
I know, and they're idiots.
Yeah. Yeah, when you look at the product, it's just a product and don't see the long-term value.
No. I mean, those guys over there, the people doing that stuff would have never thought about Netflix streaming, home media.
No.
They wouldn't have seen that. They wouldn't know.
Yeah, you couldn't envision it. Yeah.
Right. It was only the here and now, so. Anywho. All right. Well, that concludes our take on Dawson City, Frozen Time, 2016 documentary by Bill Morrison. Hopefully, the listeners have enjoyed that. And to find more of our work, did you guys? By the way, do you guys have any social media stuff you wanna? What typically happens is, I throw it to you guys and be like, you can find more of Bob's work at XYZ. But if you don't, that's fine. Give me Twitter, social media, something.
Not that I'm willing to share on the podcast.
Okay, that's fine.
No, I'm not making any plugs for anything now.
Yeah. That's okay. So to find more of our work collectively as Watching Silent Film Podcast, you can visit our website at watchingsilentfilms.wordpress.com. That's watchingsilentfilms, films plural, .wordpress.com. And we're all over the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and I don't even know where else, but everywhere it's blasted out. You can find our podcast in any of the popular podcast platforms, such as the Apple Podcasts. And if you wouldn't mind leaving a review, that would help other silent film lovers, or film lovers in general, find our podcast. And I think that's all. And our email address is watchingsilentfilms@gmail.com. If you have any questions or thoughts or comments, I'd love to hear from you. Again, that's watchingsilentfilms, films plural, @gmail.com. And that's it from us this week. Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you,
Thank
Lily.
you.
Have a good week, everyone.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
night,
you.
everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Good night.